Birds froze in midair and fell like stones to the ground. Wow, right? That is Virginia Woolf's absolutely breathtaking description of the 1608 Great Frost. It instantly sets up the incredibly vivid, striking visual style we're diving into today. Because Woolf, she didn't just write scenes, she literally painted them with her words, creating these lingering, sensory tableaus that just leap right off the page.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a 1928 feminist masterpiece that totally defies all conventions, Orlando, a biography. Virginia Woolf crafted this fantastical history of English literature as a satire, but she blended it with unbelievably lush imagery and groundbreaking explorations of gender, time, and identity. It is an absolute visual feast.
Here's how we're going to break it all down today. First, the centuries-spanning plot. Second, the longest love letter. Third, satirizing history and society. Fourth, gender, language, and limits. And finally, a legacy of adaptations.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the centuries-spanning plot, a journey through time.
Just look at the sheer absurdity of this timeline. I mean, this is definitely not your standard biography. It's a sweeping, deeply sensory journey that just totally ignores the laws of nature. Our main character, Orlando, is born as a male nobleman way back during the reign of Elizabeth I. Then, he lives for over 300 years, bumping into literary giants like Alexander Pope and Jonathan Swift, all without aging a day. We actually watch the centuries roll by before our eyes. The opulent clothes change, the architecture shifts, even the weather physically alters. But Orlando remains, eventually undergoing this incredible metamorphosis from a man to a woman right in the middle of the journey.
Now, this setting is absolutely crucial. Constantinople's shifting, multi-ethnic identity provided the ultimate cultural backdrop for Orlando's famous transformation. Back in the 17th century, the city was this teeming melting pot of Turks, Greeks, Armenians, Sephardic Jews, and Circassians. Sitting right there at the exact crossroads of Europe and Asia, it was a place with no fixed singular identity. So this dynamic, highly visual, kaleidoscopic environment, it was the absolute perfect spot for Orlando to wake up from a days-long sleep to discover that he had biologically become a woman. And the kicker? She complacently accepts the change, keeping the exact same intellect and personality as before.
Moving on to Section 2, the longest love letter, real-world inspirations.
So beneath all that fantastical plotting and those incredibly vivid historical set pieces, there's actually a deeply personal reality. We really can't talk about Orlando without talking about the women who inspired it. The whole novel was heavily influenced by the tumultuous family history of Vida Sackville-West, who was Woolf's lover and close friend. They were both part of the famous Bloomsbury Group, which was pretty well known for its liberal views on sexuality. Sackville-West's son, Nigel Nicholson, famously called this book the longest and most charming love letter in literature. And just listen to the evocative language he uses to describe Woolf's visual style here. He says, "She weaves her in and out of the centuries, tosses her from one sex to the other, dresses her in furs, lace, and emeralds, drops a veil of mist around her. Just gorgeous."
Imagine losing your beloved childhood home simply because you weren't born a man. Well, that is exactly what happened to Vida Sackville-West. Her aristocratic estate, Knoll, had to pass to a male heir. So Woolf used this intensely visual story as a kind of therapeutic tool. In the novel, the female Orlando actually succeeds in winning control of her family estate. It's a beautiful, fictional compensation for Vida's real-world heartbreak. On top of that, dressing the story up with these fantastical, time-traveling elements gave Woolf a safe allegory to explore a lesbian relationship, something that was culturally taboo to depict realistically at the time. Ultimately, it gave Woolf a way to craft this idealized, visually timeless version of Vida that would belong to her forever.
Okay, Section 3, satirizing history and society, mocking the establishment. To really get the joke about how ruthlessly Woolf satirizes traditional British historiography here, we have to look at her own father's academic theories. Sir Leslie Stephen was a historian who championed this idea of the spirit of the age. He argued that writers just reflect contemporary tastes, and that great male writers naturally embodied the vital currents of their time. Woolf, however, was having none of it. She was highly critical of historians who only looked at political and military history, completely ignoring the lives and the rich interior worlds of women.
And this is where Woolf's visual genius really shines. She completely subverts traditional history by weaponizing aesthetics. Look at the stark sensory contrast she builds to mock this whole spirit of the era idea. She pits the sparkling, brilliant vitality of the Renaissance, described with the hard fixity of diamonds, ice turning to wine and birds singing, against the oppressive, dark, pervasive dampness of the Victorian age. In those 19th century chapters, a literal, physical dampness invades both homes and minds. It causes the sexes to draw apart and forces love and death to be swaddled in fine phrases. She literally turns historical analysis into a sensory joke about Victorian repression. You also have to notice how societal expectations forced entirely different behaviors on male versus female writers. When Orlando is a man in the earlier centuries, he has absolutely zero hesitation proudly showing off his manuscript for a poem called The Oak Tree. But later on, as a woman in a different era, she constantly hides that very same manuscript whenever visitors arrive. It's a direct, biting satire mimicking the alleged behavior of Jane Austen, and it really highlights the tragic reality of how women were forced to conceal their literary ambitions in ways that men never ever had to.
Which brings us to Section 4, Gender, Language, and Limits, the Boundaries of Expression.
For a book that is so sweeping and descriptive, Woolf is actually pointing out a massive problem, the failure of words. When Orlando tries to simply say, the sky is blue and the grass is green, he utterly fails. Instead, his mind conjures up this wildly elaborate, cluttered visual imagery about Madonnas having their hair fall and girls fleeing hairy satyrs in the woods. Scholars like Victoria Smith point out that language is already heavily encumbered by patriarchal myths and representations of women. Woolf is showing us that pure, unfiltered observation, it's nearly impossible to write down because our vocabulary is just so tangled up in historical baggage.
Now, to get the complete picture of this novel, we also need to look at its boundaries. Impartially speaking, modern literary analysts, like Jane Marcus, point out that Woolf's very progressive engagement with gender hits a hard ceiling when it comes to race. This critique specifically points to a scene where Orlando kisses a black woman in the dark. Scholars argue that the text uses this figure basically as a silent projection surface. She's framed as an exoticized object symbolizing transgressive desire, but she's never actually given a voice or any agency of her own. Without taking sides here, this analysis just highlights how this reflects the colonial blind spots of both Woolf and Sackville West's aristocratic early 20th century British backgrounds. It really maps out the limits of their white feminist discourse. But at the exact same time, the text does push back against the empire in other ways. During the Constantinople chapters, Woolf actively undermines British imperialism. By having Lady Orlando safely escape the Ottoman Empire entirely alone, traveling in the company of a Romani clan, Woolf was directly attacking a major imperial justification of that era. She was dismantling the highly prejudiced notion that white women inherently needed the protection of the British Empire from non-white men.
Let's head into our final part, Section 5, A Legacy of Adaptations, Translating Text to Visuals. Because this text focuses so heavily on the limits of written language and relies on such unbelievably lush descriptions, it makes perfect sense that it naturally evolved into purely sensory visual mediums. Woolf painted such vivid pictures that Orlando has been completely irresistible to visual artists over the last century. Most famously, there's Sally Potter's iconic 1992 film starring Tilda Swinton, which brilliantly translated the novel's shifting aesthetics right onto the big screen. We've also seen stage plays, like Sarah Ruhl's off-Broadway production, and even full-scale, visually stunning operas. And more recently, in 2023, Paul B. Presida directed a documentary, freely adapting the novel to explore contemporary transgender life and identity. Orlando's fluid visual journey just continues to inspire striking, avant-garde storytelling across multiple generations.
Throughout the centuries, Orlando is occasionally haunted by the sight of a wild goose that can never quite be caught. It's so ambiguous that, in real life, a bewildered Vita Sackville West actually wrote to her husband asking what the goose was even supposed to symbolize. As Orlando chases this elusive bird at the very end of the novel, right as the clock strikes midnight in 1928, I want to leave you with this final thought. As you navigate your own timeline, what ultimate, undefinable truth are you endlessly chasing in your own life? Thanks so much for exploring this highly visual masterpiece with me today.